Today, we're going to be diving into some data. We've got both BDSA and Apex Trading giving us some retail and wholesale data on some market overview, some trends, pricing analysis, all of that coming up. Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, Capital Markets Analyst and host of your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today, we've got a pretty good podcast. We've got two guests with us, the CEO and founder of Apex Trading, John Manlove, and the Senior Vice President of Commercial Development for BDSA, Jessica Lukas. Thank you both for being with us on the Talking Hedge.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it. So let's dive into some data, talk about a little bit about, I guess we'll start with retail with Jessica and look at some maybe behavioral trends, pricing developments, some drivers behind all of that. What do you got for us, Jessica? I'm excited to see.
Yeah, sure. Given that we are sizing the market on an ongoing basis and predicting out where the markets will be out to 2026 at this point in time by state, by category, one thought I had is let's just jump in and talk about total market size. So right now we are sizing the US legal cannabis market to be about 25 billion in 2021. And I think today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about flower specifically. And we're tracking about 44% of that 25 billion coming from flower, specifically again in legal sales. So through either medical or adult use dispensaries. So we've been tracking obviously flower as, hate to call this, but as king for some time within cannabis, going back to the early days of legalization. It's interesting, and I'm sure John can chime in here too. There's a lot of talk and press and play about edibles being new, different form factors, innovation and technology, you name it. But we constantly pull back and remind people that inhalables and flower continue to be king in terms of purchasing in the retail locations. And so there's a lot of people out there that say, you know, flower is dying. But the truth behind that is, and we'll get into it, some of the decline in sales is due to pricing, not actually due to quantities purchased. So really important to call that out. So again, looking at a total legal US market in 2021 at about 25 billion, with about 45% of that coming from flower sales. Not sure, John. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say price and convenience. I was going to say are the other factors, right, of maybe why that is. Or that's at least why people go out and buy stuff. But I would imagine that a lot of the decrease in market share from flower, you know, as we always see in emerging markets being really high and then dropping down in California as low as 40%, is because of the competition from other product categories. I would imagine edibles being one of those that saw a huge influx in popularity in probably multiple parts. One, the lack of wanting to combust during COVID and being fearful of that, as well as staying from home and wanting something to last all day long. Of course, I'm having to infer on the data. I don't know why. I didn't take a 1,000,000-part survey and find out, but I'm assuming, and I'm wondering if you guys have an opinion or if you're able to infer on the data why those changes came about.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen edibles, and I'll speak at an aggregate legal market level. We've seen edibles stay and hover at about 15% of legal dollar sales across markets. And so that's been pretty stable over time. Obviously, that looks different if you view market share based on units purchased or packages purchased versus dollar sales, if that makes sense. So we have seen that edibles line kind of hover there. I think you brought up a few interesting points. So because of COVID, or during COVID times, let's not, to your point, infer that it's because of COVID, but during COVID times, we did see an increase in the percent of adults consuming cannabis in core markets like California. So the absolute percent of adults consuming cannabis over, let's go back to since March 2020, has increased. Interestingly, so we have a net increase in the addressable market of people consuming cannabis. That is both tracking any consumer, so they don't have to be legal consumers or legal purchasers. But we are also seeing that the frequency of consumption of both inhalables and edibles has increased in that time as well. So now you have this interesting dynamic of net increase in the percent of the population consuming, but those people consuming are now consuming even more frequently. And to your point, that is definitely even more significant within edibles. So we're at about 56%, I believe, within California of edibles consumers consuming at least daily. And I think some of those numbers are shocking, especially to those outside of cannabis, so beverage alcohol companies, is when I tell them, hey, we're at about 40% of adults consuming cannabis. Their first question is, oh, well, those people aren't consuming very frequently. And then you narrow that down and you say, actually, 67% of inhalable consumers in fully legal states are consuming at least daily. And those are shocking numbers to companies and people outside of this industry who don't understand actually the consumption dynamics and kind of the habitual routine nature of what this industry is for many consumers.
And I think another thing to add to that as well is the evolution of the flower market, right? Flower is still being produced, right, at the quantity. It might just not be making it direct to retail as much, which means that it's going direct to extraction for more higher grade, full flower extracted products becoming much more popular. The live resins, the higher quality type extracts, as that part of the market evolves as well. So some of the things that we've really seen in these downturns in the market is a lot of outdoor and greenhouse cultivation product going direct to extraction, even whole flower extraction, whether that's live resin or fresh frozen or just a normal BHO extraction, rather than that going into a bottom shelf or a lower shelf into retail where there's more of a flood. So I think that the flower is still there. It's just evolving where it's being sold or transacted through the supply chain. It's more upstream rather than downstream to retail sometimes.
So what you're telling me is that there's an increase in users, an increase in frequency, an increase in SKUs and products as all of these new emerging markets kind of get more SKUs behind them. And yet I think what we're going to see, if I'm, I don't want to get in front of you here, Jessica, but I think we might start to see a decrease in price. That seems like a bit of a dichotomy there between increase in users, decrease in price. I've seen transaction for California specifically, the number of transactions are increasing, but the average purchase basket is decreasing. So that's telling me that the delivery price of $65 is decreasing, because that's really what it was on average for a while up until May of this year, seemed to dip down. What that's telling me is that people are going into the store, buying less, going more often, so there's more transactions, but each time they're buying less, drawing that average item price down. So that's part of what I'm seeing. Is that reflected in the data that you have, Jessica?
I love that question, and actually it is something we can address, but I wasn't prepared to address it.
Oh, so my fault. Well, let's just talk about pricing.
Good.
Tell me about pricing trends just in general.
Yeah, let me look at something really quick. I love doing analysis on the fly. It's always fun. But I will say, I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind. And I think this is where it's like really interesting to look at average retail price. And so I believe between John and I'm going to speak to average retail price at the store. So what consumers paid, so the sell through. All pricing I speak to is predominantly pre-tax. So keep that in mind as well. John, I'll let you handle the expertise on all things wholesale pricing. But let me just show you this really quickly. So what I'm filtered to in the BDSA dashboards is California retail sales tracking year-to-date 2021, and looking at specifically edibles pricing. And so what I wanted to show you is generally, and we've seen this over the years, fairly stable pricing within edibles. We also see fairly consistent pricing for vape, but let me caveat that with vape by price tiers, because you see live resin at very different price tiers than oil or distillate, for example. If we think about the pricing tiers or those subcategories, it is still pretty relatively stable. So again, let's focus just on this blue line. Obviously, there are some shifts, but we're going from, 1770, not surprising, most edibles are 100 milligrams, 10 milligrams per dose of THC. So around, 1769, you see it dropping to 1747, but we can largely say this is pretty stable. Again, year-to-date edibles. If I flip this and toggle over to flower, don't be alarmed. I mentioned this earlier. The scale of the chart makes it look scarier. But there's still a clear trend here. And so that conversation, kind of what you just brought up, is what's going on in terms of basket sizes versus price per unit versus unit sales. And I think there's a lot to do here. Again, if we're saying, 40 to 50% of dollar sales are from flower, that means 60 to 70% of unit sales are coming from flower in the dispensary, and you're seeing this decline in price over time. So worth calling out again, this scale looks a little bit scary, but we're talking about a 10 to 15% decline in price per gram at the dispensary for flower in California between January and September of this year.
Interesting. And so the decrease in flower, is that due to more people consuming? So are they consuming the edibles? Are they consuming the vapes? And that's what's taking away flower market share?
Yeah, there's cross format consumption definitely going on. So, flower is still the number one preferred format of inhaling amongst inhalable consumers. We see that constantly, but there is more cross format consumption in terms of, depending on the experience you're seeking, time of day, need state, occasion, desire for something that's more convenient. You do see kind of people move throughout edibles, vape back to flower throughout a day or throughout a week. So you definitely are seeing some of that. I think we also have to call out, and John, I'm going to look at you to jump in here on this topic. I don't really love talking about what's happening in the illicit market, but we can't ignore it. Form factors available in the dispensary for some cases, like inhalables or concentrate products, are more difficult to get in the black market compared to flower. And so we have to consider that relationship as well, which is obviously very difficult to track in my world and John's world, where we're tracking sales of the legal products, but there is an illicit market dynamic in terms of what's available in the illicit market at what price point versus what is available to consumers in the dispensary that might provide an added benefit, frankly, that you can't get in the black market.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's true. I mean, specifically in states that have more longer standing illicit markets of production in Oregon and Northern California, right? Some of these markets, I think Oregon's been really well publicized lately with what's going on in some of the southern counties around people growing or cultivating cannabis under the guise of hemp, right? And I think we're going to see this more and more with the lack hemp regulations, and that, it's really easy for organized crime to come in and go and say, we're cultivating hemp, but at the end of the day, they're cultivating illicit market cannabis, right? And this is happening in really large amounts, especially in Southern Oregon, which is really hitting the press right now. And they've gone to the state to request funds to actually really combat this, which obviously, and when you're not having to pay the taxes and all the overheads that a business or producer has to have, and you can bring that rate straight to market, then it has an immediate impact. But let's not forget that that's not just within that state, right? This product's making it into medical states. It's making it into other recreational markets, and it has an impact on that, right? So I think for the consumer, right, and we hear this sometimes, especially in California, right, is, a $65 eighth is really expensive, when it comes down to it for a top shelf product. And if that consumer, especially that flower consumer, they probably used to consume most likely illicit market flower for a long period of time before adult use or medical was passed in their state. They have those connections probably still existing from their dealers, right? So it's pretty easy for that person to go back and say, well, if I can't afford this, and I can get the same quality product here, yeah, it might not have all the testing or some of the transparency that a lot of us would be concerned about. But if they're not, then I think they'll just shift back to that, right? So I think part of it is, the market, and the taxation and the way that retailers are pricing, it has to also take into account what's happening in the illicit part of the market to remain competitive, to bring those people in and retain those clients. And I think for us, as we look towards wholesale, the fluctuations that BDSA and Jess have mentioned here, they do directly correlate to some of what's happening, of course, at wholesale, right? Now, pricing itself, I often don't think that when the price of indoor flower falls down $300-400 a pound, I don't think the consumer often gets to see that savings at the shelf from the retailer. It's mostly the grower who gets to bear the brunt of that downward price pressure. But I also think, what happens is in those seasonality times is there's just more of a lower price product, a greenhouse or an outdoor product. And as a consumer, you're maybe just buying a little less top shelf because you're finding somewhat close to similar kind of quality, potency thing, other drivers or things that drive that consumption rather than just the grow environment itself, right? So I think for us, as we look towards wholesale, there's always been seasonal fluctuations, especially in, Western Coast, West Coast markets that have great outdoor growing conditions. But there's a lot of other factors that impact pricing that we're seeing in other states like a Michigan or Massachusetts. And a lot of that just has to come down to the age of the state and the market. And ultimately people scaling up production in lieu of, limited licenses, essentially.
You guys have an opinion on what D8 is taking away from the market, if anything at all? Because you mentioned that it's increasing accessibility, or you mentioned the decrease in price. And immediately I'm thinking of wholesale CBD being $18,000 a few years ago, right? And now it's like a couple $100 for a kilo. Same thing with other rare cannabinoids. CBG or CBN might be 18 grand now for a kilo, and that's going to plummet down to reality pretty soon. So wholesale prices will reflect that eventually. The supply and demand is going to shift with safety and concerns, the vape gate, COVID, all of that was an issue. And then now we have this supply, I guess, this overproduction of hemp. And so now there's this opportunity to squeeze out some margins in the form of Delta 8. Are you able to see from any of the data how Delta 8 is impacting some sales?
That's interesting. I mean, Jess, you might have some stuff. I mean, I think for a lot of our states, like in Oregon, they banned Delta 8, right? So like you can't consume that product. They've really tried to combat it there to keep the cannabis market healthy, right? And fight for those businesses. I think what you'll probably see is in a state like, Colorado, for instance, and Jess, I'm inferring here, but, I would think that in a state like Colorado, where you start to have some medical markets now, and then you have these restricted markets, but they have Delta 8, right? I was in North Carolina recently, same type of thing, right? Where these consumers, they're not traveling to Colorado to consume cannabis anymore, right? And they're saying, oh, I can get some form of high through these rare, these minor cannabinoids, right? That have some form of, THC. So I think there is a bit of a shift there, right? And I think it has directly impacted specifically the Colorado market as of late. There's a lot of factors, right? There's always the seasonal fluctuation with outdoor and larger greenhouse harvest at this point in time. You're always going to see a drop in pricing. And historically, we've always seen it this time of year. And consumption tends to slow down a little bit for some reason at this time of year as well. But I think the big impact is people aren't traveling as much to these cannabis states to consume, right? It's closer to their back door, or they have these CBD stores that they can go to that are offering, a different type of form of cannabinoid to consume that mimics that type of high. So maybe Jess, I don't know if you guys have done any research on that or something like that.
I mean, we have a partnership with IRI. So they are tracking sales of products in kind of mainstream retail. Let's be honest, Delta 8's not showing up in mainstream retail, but some C stores, right, are carrying this. So we're seeing that more, to your point, John, like outside of the legal markets where it's not as available. We've heard a lot about the availability of, some of these cannabinoids in states like Pennsylvania, kind of causing some havoc there. I think one thing you said that's really interesting in terms of kind of borders and traveling. I think traveling is an interesting thing for us to talk about right now, just since COVID, travel has declined overall. And what does that mean, especially in legal cannabis markets that are heavy tourist markets, let's say like Las Vegas? What are those trends? So I used to always love using our Nevada data as an example of how much tourism can shift category share, where you saw pre-rolls being a much larger percent of sales than you do in other markets, or disposable vapes for that matter. And now all of a sudden, kind of in the midst of COVID, when travel was really restricted, you definitely saw Nevada's category share start shifting and looking more like a Colorado or an Oregon. And as markets open back up, you see those things shift again. So that's one point I would just call it, just in terms of COVID and impact and travel. It's hard to directly correlate what's happening. Again, is it COVID, or is it more availability in markets where cannabis wasn't there before? We did a webinar a couple weeks ago, specifically on the Missouri market. So we just rolled out data tracking the Missouri market, and we had a few panelists from both brands, manufacturers, as well as retailers in the market. And it was fascinating, and I'm sure, John, you see this as well, to hear the struggles they're having in a medical market when they border Oklahoma in the southern part of the state. You know, or it's like you break Missouri down into regions and you have certain areas, like, why would you get a medical card when you can cross over to the border and get it in Oklahoma? It's easier, it's cheaper. Or what about the northern part of Missouri, northeast, where you're bordering Illinois, a fully adult use legal market, so you don't have to get a medical card. And so I think kind of the mention, John, of borders and what does that mean for markets, I think is something that we are trying to keep an eye on as closely as possible, because what happens state by state when, I'm going to say 60 to 70% of dispensary sales in Illinois that border Indiana, or in Michigan that border Indiana, are coming from Indiana residents. What happens as Indiana shifts over?
Yeah.
Bad example. I'm from Indiana, so I like to call it out as much as possible. But it does create this interesting dynamic of where do you go? And really quickly, let me share my screen. I just pulled up a slide really quickly. This was part of the Missouri webinar. But just a really quick view of average retail price. This is where borders start becoming fascinating as we think about being able to cross and get product for different price points. And this is the average retail price of 1 gram of flower. So all purchases equivalize to a single gram. And the Illinois and Michigan numbers here are just through the lens of the medical market, but still fascinating to think about as more and more markets emerge and as borders open up. There's really going to be complex pricing scenarios of traveling to get it somewhere else that's cheaper, even if you have to drive 2 hours. And I think that's all like part of this conversation. I think, John, you wanted to talk about kind of opening of interstate commerce, but still, it's like it's a domino effect right now of these new markets opening. And do people register to get a medical card in their state, or do they continue to travel to an adult use state to get a better price point?
And the impacts of over licensing too, because to your point, Jessica, Oklahoma has 7,500 licenses, so you could just hop over there. They're everywhere, and not maybe as impacted as a place like Las Vegas or Ontario with the borders being closed. Toronto probably saw a massive decrease in the amount of tourism impacting their sales, nonetheless creating a massive arbitrage opportunity with a 50% increase from Michigan to what was the other one that you showed? The high and low. Michigan.
Missouri.
Yeah. From $7 to $14. That's quite the arbitrage play there. Yeah. What's your take on wholesale cross borders? Because if we see Peru or Colombia come in at 15 cents per gram with landing costs, it's game over.
Yeah, we see it even, when you think about these micro state markets, right? In Oregon and Colorado, other ones. Like in Oregon, you got the border right there with Idaho, right? Ontario, there's 4 or 5 stores there, right? But they command a huge portion of sales in the state, right? And I think what we find in the wholesale side, especially for producers, is, a lot harder when you're competing in the metropolitan area where there's a lot of stores, there's a lot of production, everyone's fighting for it, right? But if you can get in early as a producer in some of these other kind of border states, the same as like Grand Junction in Colorado, right? There's a few stores there. If you're the first store hitting from Utah, you're going to have busy weekends and you're going to be able to charge a premium because people are driving there for their cannabis, right? And they're coming there to get it and go back home. Same thing's happening in Oregon with the border of Idaho, right? You've got these, largely conservative states, but they love their cannabis too, right? Let's not lie to ourselves, right? So I think what we find is that, on the wholesale level, if you're able as a producer to go and solidify a sell through in some of these border states, your pricing will not be as directly impacted as you are maybe competing in a metropolitan area, right? And we see this with some of the zip code pricing and things that we have here. When you look at pricing into zip codes, any more rural areas on the coasts, on the borders that aren't in big metropolitan areas, they do pay higher prices, right? First, it's harder to get to them. It's more costly in the same sense. So the cost to get there is more. So you have to play that in your price. But also, they have a lot of demand. They have a lot more traffic, right? So they are looking for product. They buy bigger bulk. They're willing to pay a higher price. So I think those are all very important things to think about. And so, yeah, as you say, if an Idaho was to go legal, probably the last state that probably that will possibly outside of the deep south, it will have a direct impact on those stores in Ontario, right? When Utah rolls out a medical market, it probably have a direct impact on those stores on the border. And I think that's what's important to realize too, is that there's a lot of dynamics, not only in state in general, but in specific zip codes, specific regions that have a direct impact, right? I was talking to a client in Massachusetts, a large producer there, and he really was struggling with some of the recent pricing. And I said, well, what you guys were at 4,000 a pound, of course broken down into eighths and various things, but you're commanding a high price. Joints were $8 a gram joint wholesale, which is what anyone in Oregon or Colorado or any California would dream to be able to charge, right? Those are the old school prices, right, before market. And he said, well, one producer in Massachusetts came online and flooded the market at scale, right? Their first time, they have 100,000 square feet to grow. They just flooded the market and they directly impacted every single other person's price and market, right? And we've seen that now. You don't see it as much in the very large states, but I know in Colorado, there's a company that did that several years ago, right? Came in, started selling $500 indoor pounds, sunk the market, right? So I think it also can be, a lot of it's the scale of the state, like you mentioned, Josh, about license limits and canopy limits and things. But when you open it up, right, and when cultivators get to scale after 2 to 3 years in, you see an immediate impact, a drop of pricing, right? It's just now happening in Michigan. Massachusetts is starting to experience it, right? So they're not insulated from the competition within wholesale as well, right? It does have a dramatic impact. So we kind of look at it as like, the seasonality, right? What time of the year is it? Is there more outdoor greenhouse product on market? Obviously is going to drive some prices down because there's oversupply. The age of the market, right? So as a market typically hits that 2 to 3 year after adult use, you start to see cultivation scale up, or more cultivators come online, more product on market, right? Which is going to, obviously impact price. And then I think regulations as well, right? An interesting thing, I have to look back, but when Colorado passed microbial testing on flower, right? And this was 2016, I think, right? We saw prices go from 12 to 18 overnight because cultivators weren't passing microbial tests, right? Right away. So, regulations from the state has a dramatic impact as well, specifically around new testing, right? Pesticides was another thing in Colorado that came out a little later after microbials, because we started to see all these recalls, right? There was the secret shoppers going around and finding anything they could to recall from the Department of Ag. Had a direct impact on the cultivation aspect, right, and their sell-through. So there's a lot that kind of goes into the dynamics of a market. Some of it is, are we bordered by non-cannabis states? Great, then we're probably pretty healthy on that side. Are we starting to see more licenses come on as the state controlling canopy limits, right? Are they kind of making sure that we have a really healthy market here of supply and demand? And then ultimately, what kind of new regulations are going to come down the road, and how does that impact the producer themselves, right?
Yeah, you guys remember when Oregon took all solvents off the market in 2015, and they were worried about the Florida motel explosions and stuff that was happening across the country. You mentioned scaling, and I think ultimately it's going to probably be about the cultivar. When we see macro beer, for example, and then micros, I think the micros are producing what people they're looking for that niche, whatever that is. Maybe it's the terpenes, the funk, the flavor, what have you. But post harvest season, or maybe some late harvesters right now are going to be driving the price down, like you said. But as we see in the news, everything is about a transitory inflation, like this temporary spike in price, and then it's just going to go away on its own somehow. But I've seen beef jerky go up in price over the last few years. It was $10 a pound, and now it's $10 for dust. So how is it that an eighth of cannabis has been $40 for 100 years, or forever? Are we going to see inflation? This two-part question, I guess, as I'm just kind of rambling here. How does harvest season naturally affect prices, and will we see inflation hit the cannabis market?
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on some of the wholesale stuff too, around kind of the quality, the quality aspect. I hate to say quality because we're really talking to quality around potency and grow environment. It's not necessarily quantified into terpenes and quality grading and everything we would conventionally see from other, ag products or other kind of goods. But yeah, happy to go into some of that. And I think, and I do think the Oregon market is really good indicator of this idea of a really large outdoor product, right? Market. It has these fluctuations, but it's really interesting to kind of look at the data, what's happened over the last year, to talk about, how specific products or quality can maybe be insulated, depending on what you're producing, right? And this is a really, and I'll share my screen here. So, as we look at the Oregon data, right, this is, over a year of wholesale product pricing on flower, right, ranging from a high of $1,900 a pound to the current $1,500 a pound now, right? This is across all grow environments, right, and all potencies. But if we come in and we simply just take indoor out, right, and this hybrid indoor, which is kind of there, here's your drop, right? So right now, greenhouse and outdoor is not as insulated from the dynamics of production, because you're seeing here was the high this year, and all it's done is start to go down as harvest occurs, right, over early season into late season into fall, right? And now we're down to 533 a pound, where a little over a year ago, it was $1,200 a pound, right? Massive drop. Well, if we take greenhouse and that out and we just say indoor, here's your indoor, right? Now it is dropped down to $1,600 a pound, but from 19, right? So not near a 300 pound, 300 a pound drop, right? Not near, the curve, if we were to just average this out, would be almost flat, right? So this indoor product, right, it's much more insulated from the fluctuations of pricing, I think, because mostly obviously quality is one, right? It's a, a more consistently grown product, et cetera. It may be easier to build that brand with the consumer, which maybe Jess can talk about as well. But this is the interesting thing, right? So as an outdoor, a greenhouse grower in this kind of mid to lower shelf kind of category, right, you are much more commoditized. You are much more dependent, or, your business is much more impacted by seasonal fluctuations and overproduction, right? Easier to produce greenhouse and outdoor product, less cost, a lot less cost than to scale up an indoor grow, right? So you can come into market quicker, you can put plants in the ground, you can get it harvested faster, right? Assuming you're doing your due diligence on your facility or your land. But on the other side, right, we look at the indoor, and it's somewhat more insulated, right? It's a little bit harder for those businesses to scale up and produce, maybe have that canopy size, but also, it's some of that comes back to some of the quality, right? And the quality aspects of the product, and I think even if we were to, been done this yet, but if we were to take out lower potency here, right, you're probably going to see an even flatter curve. So I think it's just interesting when we look at that to understand that, like, an indoor grower, right, you have to be much more well-funded, much more cost, of a cost per pound. But at the end of the day, you're slightly more insulated from the fluctuations, the seasonal fluctuations of pricing, obviously, compared to a greenhouse or an outdoor grower, of course,
Jessica, what are you seeing in terms of like trends? California tends to be a market leader. I'm curious, like post-pandemic, kind of where we're at, and anything that you're seeing.
Yeah, and I think this ties nicely to some of what John said, and tying all of this back together. And John, chime in here because you might disagree with me. But I think why some other form factors like concentrates or edibles have been able to maintain that kind of average retail price, or that price point, is because they've been able to innovate in ways that they could charge more. And I think that might be quote unquote easier within other form factors, and maybe even more relevant than in others. So we've seen kind of this shift over time into solventless products across the board, whether that's dabbable concentrates or vape, or even ingestibles at this point, right? Solventless gummies, live resin and the evolution there, minors and minor cannabinoids, and the fact that, CBD is in an edible product, and that edible product is now, on some cases, 20 to 25% premium priced. We're tracking now, obviously, CBN, CBG, THCA, THCV, all of these other added benefits within these product formats that are allowing people and businesses to command a higher price point. And we're seeing that across form factors, but I think fewer examples of that specifically as a marketing tactic within flower. I don't know, John, if you have anything to chime in
Well,
there.
I think the form factor producers, right, they benefit from oversupply, right?
Completely.
Their cost of trim goes down,
Yep.
the cost of plant material for extraction goes down, right? So they're able to make bigger margins, invest
Yep.
more in R&D, invest in new packaging, invest in things to keep them on the shelf and drive the consumer, right? Whether it's direct consumer marketing, whatever that brand's approach is. So, the form factor, they absolutely benefit from oversupply in market, right? I mean, that's music to the ears. I mean, we've got extractors essentially paying trim prices for whole flower, right? Now they're producing a very top shelf concentrate that can command a higher price at market, right? So it's amazing for them. They really benefit from it, all while the grower tends to suffer, right? So I do think that's important, right, to understand as well, is that their cost of production potentially is their margins go up when they're paying less for the plant extraction material to produce their products, right? So that's important. But I agree. I think that as we look towards some of the shift, it's been difficult in some of these markets. Thinking in Oregon, for instance, or Colorado, a lot of growers, they've always sold bulk pounds, right? It's what the consumers are used to. A lot are trying to pivot into prepackaged eighths, right? Or prepackaged quarters. Part of it is to build their own cultivation brand with the consumer who never really knew who they were, right? In some of these markets. So I think it's important for them thinking more as a business and maturing as ways like we have to connect with consumers so we can create that brand, and then we can introduce new product lines and start to increase our sell-through as a producer with these businesses or these consumers. But on the other side, right, is it's really hard for them to do that in these markets, right? For a retailer, they're saying, wait, I'm going to pay you now what was $1,200, $2,400 to have it come in eighths, but then I got to charge my consumer now, and I have to get them to choose your packaged flower that comes in a nice jar over the bulk flower that just gets put into a pill bottle and sent over to you, right? So that is, I think, the evolution that's really hard. Like in Massachusetts, we're all prepackaged.
Yep.
Then it's a little easier, right? In Michigan, a little bit different, right? California, a little different, right? Where we have these brands that have really pushed that, the cookies, the various other ones. So I think that's important to understand, but it is hard for the growers themselves to pivot into being able to charge somehow a higher price to the retailer for essentially the same product just coming in a different package, right? And that's where we've seen some of the difficulty there for those businesses as they've tried to evolve. And I think specifically in Colorado, I know it's been a really big challenge for a lot of companies who have wanted to connect with that consumer, have wanted to try and find ways to differentiate on the shelf outside of just the strain name with a 28.6% potency right on it. Like, how do I connect with that consumer more? But it's also convincing the retailer there's value in that. And I think that's some of the difficulty for them sometimes.
Well, it's interesting. We actually had a conversation yesterday internally about what has shifted in Colorado over the last 7 years in terms of deli versus pre-pack branded, to your point. And so seeing this evolution of the market, where when we started tracking the market, it was all deli, weighted there and put in a bag and go on. And now completely shifting. I don't know the exact percentages, but it's definitely at least, I believe 50-50 deli versus pre-packed branded. So definitely watching that evolution in Colorado, which is very different, to your point, than other markets we track where everything's pre-packed and branded, pre-weighted and branded, however we want to word it. And we're seeing in Colorado, to your point, John, specifically, retailers are now saying, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to wholesale it to other retailers. So you're seeing retailer brands become store brands like you do in the vertical nature of like in Illinois, where everyone is, it's Green Thumb, it's Cresco, it's PharmaCann, it's Verano, and they're all selling their own products in their own stores, but wholesaling it across to one another. It's interesting. Obviously, we're not to that degree of few competitors, but we are starting to see kind of more of that dynamic at play, even in Colorado.
That's
well,
really
we all know it's easier to sell an eighth right out the door than to pay a bud tender to pick it out and weigh it and pick off the stems and stuff, right? So some of it also is I think the retailer becoming more educated, like, wait, I could really cut my costs of labor down by just simplifying this process of the sale, right? Which I think also is the maturity of the business owner, kind of understanding okay, what are we wasting labor on?
And the other thing, and I don't think we talked about it live yet, but you look at the reasons people buy what they buy, and you talk to flower and inhalables consumers specifically, and high THC, taste and flavor and price matter. strain they've used before and brand they used before, also a top 10 driver. So all of a sudden, if brand of flower matters, being able to go back and get that brand, is worth considering what that means. Also, let's be clear, consumers are telling us strain matters more than brand. But one thing for BDSA selfishly is, I'll tell you, like pre-packed branded flower is much easier to clean in terms of data coming in than the deli that, deli weighted, however the retailers type that into their point of sale system. So like cleanliness of tracking definitely improves in markets where it is all pre-packed.
Right. We don't have that luxury in Washington State, one of the most competitive markets that's non-vertically integrated and no stores. You don't have the cookie store, True Leaf store, which is good and bad. You walk in and there's 2,000 SKUs, so you're so overwhelmed you walk out because you don't know what to do. So there's that. But I'm wondering, with the advent of delivery, as we're seeing more and more people go to delivery, because when you go to a grocery store and there's like 3 employees, who wants to stand in line for an hour? That's at least my take. That's what's happening here in Seattle. And that's my response is like, okay, I guess we're just ordering everything. And so how do you connect with the consumer? How do you have, when you've been relying on bud tenders to give that to you, in the advent of Germany recently legalizing or announcing that they're going to legalize, when I was working with the World Trade Center on their e-commerce platform, China came in and wanted 3,000 tons of hemp seed that we tried to connect them with Australia and a whole bunch of other folks. And so it seems to be that people are navigating through online e-commerce platforms to do that. What are some other drivers that you're seeing that people are looking for when making purchases in the realm of absentee of the retail shop? Seems like delivery is the way to go. Do you have any comments or anything to that effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to look at California when you're talking delivery or direct to consumer, paving the way and have been for some time, where some of other markets, I live in Colorado, where we're just now entering the world of delivery being legal, and it kind of starting out. It's interesting. So we get point of sale transactional level data feeds coming in from a big percent of the retailers across all of the states. And so we can see the fulfillment method. So in California specifically, and by fulfillment method, I mean online pre-order and pickup versus delivery versus in-store. And what we've seen over time in California specifically, within retail locations that have at least 2 fulfillment methods, is this hovering around now by month 20 to 25% of sales coming from e-commerce. So whether that's pre-order, pickup, or delivery. But again, that's amongst stores specifically that have multiple fulfillment methods. That doesn't account for your delivery only licenses and your delivery only platforms that are separate from that, obviously 100% e-commerce. The interesting thing though is at the I don't know, what do we call pre-COVID, COVID? Are we post-COVID? Are we still in COVID? I'm not sure. But let's say March 2020 through May 2020. So like the height of lockdown, we saw those percents jump to about, I believe, 40 to 50% of fulfillment coming from e-commerce within those retailers that have multiple. So you definitely saw a huge spike. However, we've seen that come back and stabilize around that 20%. So it didn't hit 40% and maintain. We definitely saw it shift back. I think that comes to like consumer education, consumer awareness, potentially even the fun for some of shopping for cannabis products is different than your groceries. That feels like a chore. So I think there's a lot of dynamics at play, but I mean, we talk about e-commerce every day. It is not something we can ignore. And to your point, there have been significant changes in behavior, whether that's Grubhub, DoorDash, Instacart, whatever it might be, coming from COVID, and this becoming the new norm for people.
And I can't speak to retail, but I think, Joshua, we're seeing in Washington the petition to try and allow direct to consumer sales from a cultivation, right? We're starting to see California, certain brands and producers starting to do direct to consumer sales, right? Of course, through a third party license, however they have to work it to legally be able to do it, right? I think it's becoming much, much more of a push, because as you see this oversaturation of market and downward price pressure, a grower is like, well, if I can sell $25 eighths, right, instead of $1,200 pounds, I'm making twice as much money. And now I own the relationship with the consumer and they love my brand and they're coming back to me, right? So I think there is this push for in certain states, right? And I think Washington being a all packaged flower market, et cetera, that's had some woes with overproduction, again, downward price pressure, et cetera, is the push for some of these brands now is to become a little more power and more well capitalized to petition to the state to say, hey, allow us through whatever the structure is to sell direct consumers and circumvent the retail, right? Or circumvent the delivery service, right? And I do think this is going to be something we'll see occur more and more potentially in some of these markets as they just find ways to support the business owner, right? And finding ways to really help. And I think that's, it's important, whether that's, the brand going through other parties or, conventional geofencing marketing or targeting or whatever to try and really understand the demographic and market directly to them through whatever that agency or that third party service is important. But ultimately, I think they're going to try and really push for that direct sales as well if they can.
So I'm curious, as we've I could go on for another hour, I think, because there's a lot, but we got to wrap this up with the crystal ball prediction. And I'm curious if, after pulling all of this together, can we say that we've seen in the existing marketplace, same store sales have peaked? What is your crystal ball prediction? I'm going to throw that out there as a loaded question. I tend to think that until we have beverages or any other products, I think it seems to be that with the economy the way it is, people are pulling back. Inflation has maybe crept in. I don't know, but it looks like pricing and people's purchasing is being pulled back. What is your take? What is your crystal ball prediction?
Do you want me to go first, John?
I'm happy to go. I mean, I think for us, as we look at just wholesale flower in general, I think pricing is just going to keep falling here for a while. I think they've had a really rough road this year, especially the latter part of this year. And I think it will continue at least into Q1 to Q2 next year. I think it's going to take a while. I think that a lot of these markets in general are back to kind of where they were a couple of years ago. I think COVID in general saw a lot of increased consumption. They're starting to make good record prices. Everyone scaled up. Everyone started overproduction. Now they're back to where they were, like in Oregon, where they were in 2016, 2015, where we saw massive falling in pricing. I think we're going to see that again. I think certain brands, certain producers are going to be insulated from it, but the market in general, over the next 6 months, you're going to continue to see price decline until people get flushed out or until the market conditions shift and consumption gets back up. I think I saw an article recently. It's like consumer sales in Colorado dipped for the first time ever this year compared to the year before, right? I mean, that's a pretty good indicator that that it's that's obviously going to directly correlate back to wholesale.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about year over year, even in the most mature, do we call them legacy markets? I don't know what we call markets anymore, but the most mature, the California, Colorado, Oregon, Washingtons, where year over year we have seen growth. Growth in terms of the number of dispensaries, growth in terms of number of brands, and growth in terms of the number of consumers. So I think actually, Josh, the question about same store sales is fascinating. And now I'm going to go talk to my analyst because I want to run that specifically since honestly 2014. Can we run that in Colorado? Because I think it would be a really interesting exercise, because you're probably right. It's probably peaked in some markets. Despite, again, more form factors, more brands, more consumers, there's also more stores in a lot of cases. And so kind of where does that weigh out? Generally, I mean, we're continuing to predict growth even in the most mature markets year over year, as far out as 2026. Again, a lot of drivers happening there. In terms of other crystal ball predictions, I mean, you guys called out one of them, the dragging of the FDA on hemp is begging the question, like, did we miss the opportunity that could have been a hemp-derived CBD market in mainstream retail? And that's something that we are kind of debating internally at BDSA. We're also kind of predicting the shift in, John, I want you to chime in on this one. Like, can I call it the death of the classification of indica, sativa, and hybrid as we think about genetic compositions, cannabinoid profiles, ratios, and terpenes? Are we getting closer and closer to the death of indica, sativa, hybrid? I think that is another prediction we're throwing out there. And with kind of the innovation in the technology, we have and are already seeing more distinct what we call pricing tiers, which is kind of exciting to see come out to play across these form factors, more similar to what you see within whiskey and beverage alcohol, or beer for that matter, kind of really kind of benefit-driven, functional benefit-based pricing tiers, which start breaking down the market in really different, interesting ways.
That's great.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the sativa into hybrid has as much, impact as it maybe most recently did, where you'd see sativas really peak in the spring, summer months. And indicas now, I think we're starting to see, kind of flatness where it's not necessarily impacting that. And I think to your point, it really comes back again. The strain name, is it hype? Is it this? Is it old? Whatever it is, and the potency, and then obviously those quantifications of quality, the terpene, the aroma, the presentation of the product, et cetera, I think are starting to have much more of an impact on consumer and pricing than before, where it was like, again, that, sativa indica hybrid shelf, right? People are a little less concerned with that. They're really focused on the impacts of the product. I think it's just the maturation of space, the maturity of the bud tenders, the producers, the education to consumers, the consumer becoming more savvy about what they're looking for. I don't think back in the day when I was consuming before, adult use or medical, I didn't go to my flower dealer and be like, yeah, man, I want this certain strain of this thing. It's like, hey, what do you have that's good? And I think that's still, sometimes, we forget that a little bit,
I tried recently on Facebook because I wanted the experience of buying something illegal, like buying drugs on the internet, just to have that experience. And I asked him about, if he had particular cultivars or whatever. And yeah, that relationship ended very, very quickly. Just like this interview, unfortunately, is ending a lot quicker than I would like it to. But I want to thank my guests. We're gonna have to roll this one up. So, CEO and founder of Apex Trading, John Manlove, appreciate you being on the Talking Hedge, as well as Jessica Lukas. She's the Senior VP Commercial Development with BDSA. Appreciate you as well being on the Talking Hedge with us.
Thanks, Josh. Happy to talk pricing anytime.
Yeah, hopefully next quarter, sometime soon, but we're gonna have to go. So I'm Josh Kincaid. This is the Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out. Don't forget to smash that like button on your way out and check out these other videos that we've got.